in his manner and a subdued excitement. "We'll go to a place where we can have a private room," he said. Then we can talk things out." So they went this time to the Rococo in Germain Street, and upstairs to a landing upon which stood a bald-headed waiter with whiskers like a French admiral and discretion beyond all limits in his manner. He seemed to have expected them. He ushered them with an amiable flat hand into a minute apartment with a little gas stove, a silk crimson-covered sofa, and a bright little table, gay with napery and hothouse flowers. "Odd little room," said Ann Veronica, dimly apprehending that obtrusive sofa. "One can talk without undertones, so to speak," said Ramage. "It's private." He stood looking at the preparations before them with an unusual preoccupation of manner, then roused himself to take her jacket, a little awkwardly, and hand it to the waiter who hung it in the corner of the room. It appeared he had already ordered dinner and wine, and the whiskered waiter waved in his subordinate with the soup forthwith. "I'm going to talk of indifferent themes," said Ramage a little fussily, "until these interruptions of the service are over. Then we shall be together. How did you like Tristan?" Ann Veronica paused the fraction of a second before her reply came. "I thought much of it amazingly beautiful." "Isn't it? And to think that man got it all out of the poorest little love story for a respectable titled lady. Have you read of it?" "Never." "It gives in a nutshell the miracle of art and the imagination. You get this queer, irascible musician, quite impossibly and unfortunately in love with a wealthy patroness, and then out of his brain comes this, a tapestry of glorious music, setting out love to lovers, lovers who love in spite of all that is wise and respectable and right." Ann Veronica thought. She did not want to seem to shrink from conversation, but all sorts of odd questions were running through her mind. "I wonder why people in love are so defiant, so careless of other considerations." "The very hares grow brave. I suppose because it is the chief thing in life." He stopped and said earnestly, "It is the chief thing in life, and everything else goes down before it. Everything, my dear, everything. But we have got to talk upon indifferent themes until we have done with this blond young gentleman from Bavaria." The dinner came to an end at last, and the whiskered waiter presented his bill and evacuated the apartment and closed the door behind him with an almost ostentatious discretion. Ramage stood up and suddenly turned the key in the door in an off-hand manner. "Now," he said, "no one can blunder in upon us. We are alone, and we can say and do what we please. We two." He stood still looking at her. Ann Veronica tried to seem absolutely unconcerned. The turning of the key startled her, but she did not see how she could make an objection. She felt she had stepped into a world of unknown usages. "I have waited for this," he said, and stood quite still, looking at her until the silence became oppressive. "Won't you sit down?" she said, "and tell me what you want to say?" Her voice was flat and faint. Suddenly she had become afraid. She struggled not to be afraid. After all, what could happen? He was looking at her very hard and earnestly. "Ann Veronica," he said. Then, before she could say a word to arrest him, he was at her side. "Don't!" she said, weakly, as he had bent down and put one arm about her, and seized her hands with his disengaged hand and kissed her almost upon her lips. He seemed to do 10 things before she could think to do one, to leap upon her and take possession. Ann Veronica's universe, which had never been altogether so respectful to her as she could have wished, gave a shout and whirled head over heels. Everything in the world had changed for her. If hate could kill, Ramage would have been killed by a flash of hate. "Mr. Ramage!" she cried, and struggled to her feet. "My darling!" he said, clasping her resolutely in his arms. "My dearest!" "Mr. Ramage!" she began, and his mouth sealed hers, and his breath was mixed with her breath. Her eye met his 4 inches away, and he was glaring, immense, and full of resolution, a stupendous monster of an eye. She shut her lips hard, her jaw hardened, and she set herself to struggle with him. She wrenched her head away from his grip and got her arm between his chest and hers. They began to wrestle fiercely. Each became frightfully aware of the other as a plastic energetic body, of the strong muscles of neck against cheek, of hands gripping shoulder blade and waist. "How dare you!" she panted, with her world screaming and grimacing insult at her. "How dare you!" They were both astonished at the other's strength. Perhaps Ramage was the more astonished. Ann Veronica had been an ardent hockey player and had a course of jiu-jitsu in the high school. Her defence ceased rapidly to be in any sense ladylike and became vigorous and effective. A strand of black hair that had escaped its hairpins came athwart Ramage's eyes, and then the knuckles of a small but very hardly clenched fist had thrust itself with extreme effectiveness and painfulness under his jawbone and ear. "Let go!" said Ann Veronica, through her teeth, strenuously inflicting agony, and he cried out sharply and let go and receded a pace. "Now!" said Ann Veronica. "Why did you dare to do that?" Part 3. Each of them stared at the other, set in a universe that had changed its system of values with kaleidoscopic completeness. She was flushed, and her eyes were bright and angry. Her breath came sobbing, and her hair was all abroad in wandering strands of black. He, too, was flushed and ruffled. One side of his collar had slipped from its stud, and he held a hand to the corner of his jaw. "You vixen!" said Mr. Ramage, speaking the simplest first thought of his heart. "You had no right," panted Ann Veronica. "Why on earth," he asked, "did you hurt me like that?" Ann Veronica did her best to think she had not deliberately attempted to cause him pain. She ignored his question. "I never dreamt," she said. "What on earth did you expect me to do, then?" he asked. Part 4. Interpretation came pouring down upon her almost blindingly. She understood now the room, the waiter, the whole situation. She understood. She leapt to a world of shabby knowledge, of furtive base realizations. She wanted to cry out upon herself for the uttermost fool in existence. "I thought you wanted to have a talk to me," she said. "I wanted to make love to you." "You knew it," he added, in her momentary silence. "You said you were in love with me," said Ann Veronica. "I wanted to explain I said I loved and wanted you." The brutality of his first astonishment was evaporating. "I am in love with you. You know I am in love with you. And then you go and half throttle me. I believe you've crushed a gland or something. It feels like it." "I'm sorry," said Ann Veronica. "What else was I to do?" For some seconds she stood watching him, and both were thinking very quickly. Her state of mind would have seemed altogether discreditable to her grandmother. She ought to have been disposed to faint and scream at all these happenings. She ought to have maintained a front of outraged dignity to veil the sinking of her heart. She would like to have to tell it so. But indeed that is not at all a good description of her attitude. She was an indignant queen. No doubt she was alarmed and disgusted within limits, but she was highly excited, and there was something, some low adventurous strain in her being, some element, subtle at least if base, going about the rioting ways and crowded insurgent meeting-places of her mind, declaring that the whole affair was after all, they are the only words that express it, a very great lark indeed. At the bottom of her heart she was not a bit afraid of Ramage. She had unaccountable gleams of sympathy with and liking for him. And the grotesquest fact was that she did not so much loathe as experience with a quite critical condemnation this strange sensation of being kissed. Never before had any human being kissed her lips. It was only some hours after that these ambiguous elements evaporated and vanished and loathing came, and she really began to be thoroughly sick and ashamed of the whole disgraceful quarrel and scuffle. He, for his part, was trying to grasp the series of unexpected reactions that had so wrecked their